What happens when a former duchess sits down for what was meant to be a friendly chat and ends up walking off live TV in front of millions? Viewers across Britain froze as one of the most shocking talk show moments in years unfolded before their eyes. Tonight, we're breaking down the full story of Meghan Markle's heated clash with Jonathan Ross, what sparked it, what she said, and why the cameras caught more than anyone expected. Make sure you hit subscribe right now because what you're about to see will completely change the way you look at live television and the royal narrative itself. What happens when a simple TV interview turns into one of the most talked about moments in British television? When a guest who once wore a royal title decides she has heard enough and walks off live on air. That is exactly what happened when Meghan Markle sat down with Jonathan Ross. What began as a warm, light-hearted conversation quickly turned into something very different. Within minutes, the studio fell silent, the audience froze, and cameras captured a moment that would echo across social media for days. It was supposed to be a friendly appearance. Meghan had agreed to join Jonathan for what producers called an open and relaxed chat. The plan was to talk about her new projects and life after stepping away from royal duties. But the energy inside the studio told another story. From the moment she walked on stage, you could sense something sharp in the air. The crowd cheered, but Meghan's smile seemed tight, as if she knew this was not going to be easy. Jonathan looked his usual charming self, cracking jokes, but behind that easy laugh was curiosity, maybe even a bit of challenge. No one in that room knew they were about to witness a conversation that would spiral so far out of control. What began as polite questions about life and privacy would soon push both of them into uncomfortable territory. By the end, the cameras captured not laughter but tension so thick you could feel it through the screen. Hit subscribe and stay with us till the end because what happened next left even Jonathan Ross speechless. The lights inside the studio were warm and bright, bouncing off the familiar red sofa that had hosted countless celebrity guests before. Jonathan Ross was in his element, smiling, waving to the crowd, and trading jokes with the audience as cameras rolled. There was laughter, applause, and that classic buzz of a live show that promised an easy night of entertainment. Everyone expected another relaxed chat filled with charm, humor, and good stories. Then Meghan Markle stepped onto the stage. She walked in with confidence, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, her posture straight, her smile controlled. The crowd erupted in applause, but even from the first few seconds something felt slightly off. Meghan smiled and waved, but her eyes scanned the room in a quick, assessing way. It was the look of someone who knew she was entering not just a talk show, but a potential battlefield of public opinion. Jonathan greeted her warmly, offering his usual charm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his tone that hinted at what was coming. As they settled onto the red sofa, the mood remained polite. Meghan spoke about her new projects, her involvement in humanitarian work, and the changes she had made in her life since stepping away from royal duties. The audience listened closely, some nodding, some whispering. But beneath the surface, the energy in the room had shifted. There was tension hiding behind every smile, an unspoken awareness that this conversation might not stay light for long. Jonathan leaned in slightly, ready to move from small talk to deeper questions, and Meghan's body language tightened just a little. The real conversation was about to begin. Before we dive into what went so wrong, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because you will not want to miss the next royal confrontation story coming up soon. Jonathan started the interview in his usual relaxed way. He leaned back on the sofa, smiled, and asked light questions about Meghan's life in California. She answered politely, speaking about the weather, her garden, and how her children were growing fast. Her voice was calm and warm, but something about her tone carried a quiet edge. Each time she mentioned her new life, she chose her words carefully, as if measuring how they might be twisted or quoted later. The audience could feel that caution even if they could not name it. Jonathan moved to her projects. He asked about her upcoming documentary and she smiled again, explaining how it focused on community and kindness. It was exactly the kind of topic she was known for, but her smile did not quite reach her eyes. When Jonathan joked that she seemed happier far away from royal cameras, she laughed softly, but her hand tightened around her knee. That small gesture told a different story. The crowd laughed at the host's playful remark, but Meghan's reaction drew a few raised eyebrows. Her answers became shorter, her tone more focused. She spoke about wanting privacy and peace, and the need to build a life beyond headlines. There was no anger in her words, but a steady firmness that hinted at frustration. Jonathan noticed the change. His easy tone shifted slightly as he tried to pull her back into friendly ground. He mentioned that public life always comes with attention, and Meghan nodded but quickly replied that attention is not the same as invasion. That line caught the audience off guard. A quiet wave of murmurs moved across the room. Jonathan smiled politely, but his eyes showed curiosity. He had just found something worth exploring. The air inside the studio felt heavier now. The lights were just as bright, but the energy had changed. The polite small talk had slipped away, replaced by a quiet tension that everyone could feel building under the surface. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice turning curious. He said that many people in Britain were still fascinated by Meghan's life. He mentioned how every photo, every statement, and every appearance seemed to create headlines within minutes. He asked if she ever felt flattered by the attention. His tone was casual, but his question carried weight. Meghan smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. She said she understood that public curiosity was natural, especially given her past role in the royal family. Then she paused and added that there was a difference between public interest and public intrusion. The audience grew quiet. Even Jonathan hesitated for a second before replying. He asked her what she meant by intrusion. Meghan's answer was steady but sharp. She said that being followed, having her children's routines exposed, and seeing personal letters printed in newspapers was not curiosity, it was harassment. The lights seemed to grow harsher as she spoke, or maybe it was just how serious the atmosphere had become. The laughter and warmth from earlier were gone. In their place was a silence filled with discomfort and truth. Jonathan nodded and said that many celebrities deal with media attention, but Meghan leaned forward slightly and said that this was different. She described it as a campaign of constant judgment. Every outfit, every gesture, even her silence had been turned into a story. The camera caught her expression, calm but firm, her voice unwavering. She said she was tired of being treated like an open book for strangers to read and rewrite. The audience shifted uneasily in their seats. Some nodded, some whispered. Jonathan, always the professional, tried to steer the talk back to neutral ground. He mentioned that the media's job is to reflect public interest. Meghan's eyes met his, and she said softly that there is a difference between reflecting interest and feeding obsession. That line hung in the air. For a moment, Jonathan said nothing. The studio lights caught both of their faces, one thoughtful, the other steady and unshaken. You could feel the conversation turning into something more serious than either of them had planned. The tension was now visible, sitting between them like a third guest on the sofa, quiet but powerful. The interview had officially crossed into new territory. Meghan took a slow breath before speaking again. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharper tone underneath it now. She said that the problem was not just curiosity, it was the double standard that had followed her from the very start. The audience leaned in, sensing that she was about to say something important. She gave examples. When another royal wore a similar outfit, it was described as elegant and timeless. When she wore it, the same headline called it excessive or attention-seeking. When she supported a charity, the media praised her relatives for being compassionate but called her actions calculated. Meghan's voice did not rise, but her words cut cleanly through the air. She said that kindness was praised when it came from others, but questioned when it came from her. Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat. His usual smile faded just a little. He tried to keep the conversation light by asking if she thought that criticism came from being a public figure or from something more personal. Meghan looked straight at him and said it was both. She said that it was easy for the press to hide behind words like public interest, when the truth was that some people had decided early on that she did not belong. The audience went quiet. You could feel the room holding its breath. Jonathan nodded slowly, pretending to be neutral, but his face showed discomfort. He was realizing this conversation was not about gossip or headlines anymore. It was about the system that had built those headlines. Meghan continued, her tone still controlled but firmer now. She said that when she worked, her motives were questioned, and when she stayed silent, she was accused of hiding. There was no version of her that was ever allowed to simply exist. Her words hung in the air like a quiet accusation, not just toward the press, but toward everyone who had played along with the same story. The room felt still. The friendly interview had turned into a mirror, reflecting something uncomfortable that no one in that audience could ignore. Jonathan leaned forward, his tone changing from curious to careful. He asked if Meghan believed the criticism she faced came only from the media, or if she thought the royal institution itself had played a part. His question hung in the air for a moment. The audience shifted in their seats, waiting for her response. Meghan took a second before answering, her expression calm but serious. She said that what had happened to her went beyond criticism. It felt like a pattern of character assassination, something planned to control the story about who she was. Jonathan raised his eyebrows slightly. He repeated her words to make sure he heard correctly. Character assassination? He asked. Meghan nodded. She said that when lies are printed again and again, when half-truths are dressed as facts, it stops being a mistake. It becomes a strategy. Her voice stayed steady, but the frustration behind it was clear. Jonathan tried to challenge her gently. He said the institution had traditions to protect and that public image was part of that. Meghan looked at him directly and said protection should not come at the cost of truth. Her words hit hard and the audience could feel the weight of them. Jonathan gave a small laugh, trying to ease the tension, but the moment had already turned. The room no longer felt like a talk show, it felt like a courtroom. The exchange grew faster. Jonathan asked if she was suggesting that people inside the palace deliberately leaked against her. Meghan replied that she did not need to suggest it because the pattern spoke for itself. Each denial from the palace had arrived after a story had already done its damage. The audience watched as the balance of power on that sofa shifted. Jonathan was used to leading the conversation, but now he was the one reacting. The air in the studio felt heavy. The laughter that once filled the room had disappeared completely. The lights seemed brighter, the silence sharper. Meghan had stopped being a guest. She had become a witness to her own experience, standing her ground as the tension between her and the host grew stronger with every passing second. Meghan takes a quiet breath, her eyes steady but her voice sharper now. She says there was a pattern, not of misunderstanding but of something intentional. The stories that painted her as difficult, demanding, or cold were not accidents. They came from inside the palace walls. She pauses, choosing her words with precision, then says the word, complicity. The room goes still. Jonathan blinks, unsure if he heard her correctly. He leans forward slightly and asks, "Are you saying people within the royal household were complicit in leaking stories about you?" His tone is careful, but his expression gives away his disbelief. Meghan nods once, calm but firm. She explains that every time she tried to correct false information, the palace press office told her to stay silent. She says that silence is often portrayed as dignity, but in her case, it became permission for others to twist the truth. Her hands rest on her lap now, but her voice carries quiet strength. She says when she realized that some of those stories were not just leaked but approved, it felt like betrayal from the inside. The audience lets out a collective gasp. Jonathan glances toward the crew as if unsure whether to continue. The atmosphere feels heavier now, as if the air itself is reacting. Meghan softens her tone. She says she understands that the institution protects its image, but she asks at what cost. She says loyalty cannot mean sacrificing truth. She adds that the difference between silence and complicity is knowing something is wrong and letting it happen anyway. Jonathan exhales, clearly rattled. He repeats the word complicity, as if trying to process its weight. Meghan looks directly at him and says she did not expect protection, but she did expect fairness. Her voice drops slightly, calm but cutting. The cameras catch her expression measured, cold, and steady. The tension is electric. Even the audience, who came expecting gossip, now senses something deeper. The energy in the room shifts from curiosity to unease. Meghan's tone is no longer angry. It is quiet, dangerous calm, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. Jonathan straightens in his chair, his tone turning careful but firm. He reminds Meghan that what she is saying could have legal implications. His voice carries the kind of warning that sounds polite but loaded. The audience shifts uncomfortably, unsure where this is heading. Meghan does not flinch. She looks at him calmly and says that truth does not fear consequences. If there are legal implications, she adds, then perhaps the wrong people have been protected for too long. Her words land with quiet force. Jonathan tries to move the conversation towards safer ground, but Meghan keeps her focus. She says the media plays a crucial role in this entire system, because stories do not exist without cooperation. Reporters do not just find things out. They are often handed information. She points out that every major negative story about her appeared in multiple outlets within hours, often using the same phrases or anonymous quotes. She calls it a pattern, not a coincidence. Jonathan listens, but his expression tightens. Meghan continues, saying she kept track of when stories were leaked and when palace announcements followed. The timing, she explains, always seemed to shift attention away from someone else's problem. Her tone is sharp but steady, a mix of frustration and control. She says this is not about bitterness. It is about accountability. If someone inside can leak private information to shape headlines, then the issue is not her silence, but the system that rewards betrayal. The audience begins to applaud lightly, sensing her composure under pressure. Jonathan tries to steer back to neutrality, but Meghan ends with a line that silences the room. She says free press means responsibility, not license. Her tone is defiant, but her eyes show calm conviction. The The power balance has shifted completely. The tension in the room slowly begins to fade. Meghan's voice softens and her posture shifts. For the first time during the interview, she looks less like someone defending herself and more like someone revealing her truth. She says that everything she did, every moment she endured, came from a place of love. Love for her husband, love for the family she hoped to build, and love for the idea that things could change. She explains that she stayed as long as she did because she truly believed progress was possible. She wanted to believe that compassion could win over cruelty, and that the institution could learn to embrace difference rather than fear it. Her words hang in the air, carried by a quiet honesty that draws the audience in. She talks about how hard it was to see headlines twist her actions, to watch her sincerity turned into spectacle. But she adds that leaving was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. She says she left to protect her peace and to protect her children from the same cruelty she faced. Meghan's tone is calm, but her eyes glisten. The studio feels heavy, almost sacred in its silence. Jonathan watches her carefully, realizing the conversation has turned into something far deeper than controversy. Meghan finishes by saying she still believes in kindness, even when it is not returned. She still believes in speaking the truth, even when it is inconvenient. Her voice carries both pain and strength, a reminder that behind the headlines is a human being who tried to hold on to hope. The audience remains quiet for a moment, then begins to applaud softly. It is not for drama this time. It is for empathy. The tension in the room slowly begins to fade. Meghan's voice softens and her posture shifts. For the first time during the interview, she looks less like someone defending herself and more like someone revealing her truth. She says that everything she did, every moment she endured, came from a place of love. Love for her husband, love for the family she hoped to build, and love for the idea that things could change. She explains that she stayed as long as she did because she truly believed progress was possible. She wanted to believe that compassion could win over cruelty, and that the institution could learn to embrace difference rather than fear it. Her words hang in the air, carried by a quiet honesty that draws the audience in. She talks about how hard it was to see headlines twist her actions, to watch her sincerity turned into spectacle. But she adds that leaving was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. She says she left to protect her peace and to protect her children from the same cruelty she faced. Meghan's tone is calm, but her eyes glisten. The studio feels heavy, almost sacred in its silence. Jonathan watches her carefully, realizing the conversation has turned into something far deeper than controversy. Meghan finishes by saying she still believes in kindness, even when it is not returned. She still believes in speaking the truth, even when it is inconvenient. Her voice carries both pain and strength, a reminder that behind the headlines is a human being who tried to hold on to hope. The audience remains quiet for a moment, then begins to applaud softly. It is not for drama this time. It is for empathy. The atmosphere in the studio tightens again as Meghan leans slightly forward in her chair. Her expression is calm, but her words cut through the air with precision. She looks directly at Jonathan and asks if he has ever questioned others the same way he has questioned her. The studio falls silent. Her tone is not angry, just pointed, almost surgical. She asks whether he has ever pressed other guests about the stories written about them, or if the hard questions only come when it is her sitting in the chair. Jonathan tries to respond, but his voice hesitates. He begins to say it is his job to ask difficult questions, but Meghan gently interrupts. She says that true journalism should hold everyone to the same standard, not just the person who is easiest to criticize. The audience shifts uncomfortably in their seats. Cameras catch Jonathan's face as he blinks, searching for the right words, but nothing lands. Meghan continues, saying that conversations like this should not be about who can win an argument. They should be about fairness, accountability, and respect. Jonathan nods slowly, the tension visible in his jaw. For the first time, the balance of power in the interview changes. Meghan is no longer the guest defending herself. She has turned the spotlight back on the interviewer, forcing everyone watching to consider what kind of questions deserve to be asked in the first place. The air inside the studio feels heavy. Every camera, every light, every breath seems to freeze in place. Meghan looks at Jonathan one last time, her expression unreadable. Then she reaches for her microphone. The small movement makes a loud, crisp sound in the silence. She unclips it slowly, places it on the table, and stands. Her chair shifts back with a quiet scrape across the floor. For a moment, no one moves. The audience does not clap or whisper. They just stare. Jonathan begins to say something, but Meghan cuts him off with a steady voice. She says, "Watch me." It is not shouted. It is calm, measured, and final. Her words echo through the studio, carrying the weight of every accusation and every defense that came before. As she turns, the sound of her heels clicking against the stage fills the silence. The cameras follow her automatically, but even the operators seem hesitant. A few flashes from audience phones light up the set as she walks toward the exit. The red recording light above the cameras glows brighter, capturing every second of her departure. Jonathan sits frozen, still holding his cue cards, unsure whether to continue or stop. The crew exchanges glances, whispering to one another as Meghan disappears behind the curtain. The silence that follows is almost cinematic. It is the kind that leaves everyone aware they have just witnessed something that will be replayed, debated, and remembered far beyond that night. Jonathan sits frozen for a few seconds after Meghan leaves the stage. The audience waits, unsure if the show will continue. Then, forcing a half smile, he looks into the camera and says, "We will be right back after this break." His voice sounds calm, but his eyes show the shock of what just happened. The music cue plays and the show cuts to commercials. Within minutes, the moment spreads online. Clips of Meghan's walk-off flood social media. Millions replay her words, her tone, her calm defiance. Comment sections explode with debate. Some call it courage, saying she stood her ground against a system that never gave her peace. Others call it chaos, accusing her of turning an interview into a performance. By the next morning, headlines around the world frame it as one of the most tense television moments in years. Analysts, fans, and critics all weigh in, trying to decide who came out stronger. But behind the noise, one thing becomes clear. This was not just another celebrity interview. It was a raw confrontation between power, control, and truth, one that left a lasting mark on everyone who watched it unfold. That night was not just about Meghan Markle and Jonathan Ross. It was about truth versus image, about an individual standing against an institution that thrives on control. It was about how far someone will go to protect their voice when every word is judged, twisted, and sold to the world. Some viewers saw bravery, others saw arrogance. But whichever side you fall on, one thing is certain: moments like this remind us that the truth always finds a way to break through the noise. So what do you think? Was Meghan justified in walking out, or did she go too far on live television? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you stand. And if you enjoy stories that pull back the curtain on fame, power, and pressure, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more from the world's most unpredictable interviews.